Good evening. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this evening's Winter Enrichment Program keynote lecture. My name is Jeff Shama, I'm Professor of Electrical Engineering here at KAUST, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight is Dr. Elisabeth Churchill, who is currently the Director of User Experience at Google. Elisabeth is originally a psychologist by training. She received a PhD in cognitive science from the University of Cambridge. Her research has been in the areas of human-computer interaction, computer-mediated communication, mobile computing, and social media, with a focus on understanding people's social and collaborative interactions in everyday and in physical contexts. Her prior experience before joining Google includes Director of Human-Computer Interaction at eBay Research Labs and Principal Research Scientist at Yahoo Research, where she founded the Internet Experiences Group. Among her, Dr. Elisabeth's many distinctions, she is a distinguished scientist of the ACM. For those of you who are not from the CS and computing community, ACM stands for the Association for Computing Machinery. It is the world's largest scientific and educational computing society, where she is also the Secretary-Treasurer. She serves on the advisory board of a number of university departments, and she is a distinguished visiting scholar at Stanford University's MediaX Institute. We're very pleased to have her this evening. The title of tonight's lecture is The Past, Present, and Future of Human-Computer Interaction. This is a topic that touches all of us. And so in recognition of this topic, I'd like you all to put away your smartphones and join me in welcoming Dr. Elisabeth to KAUST.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be here. And although everyone's put their phones away, I'm going to put this down here. I'm going to be talking quite a lot about phones and about interfaces on phones. So for the purposes of looking at your phone screens at the right moments, you're allowed to bring them out. So human-computer interaction as a field of study, it's a discipline concerned with the design, implementation, and evaluation of all interactive computing systems that are for human use, and with the study of major phenomena surrounding them. This is my favorite definition. It comes from actually the early 90s, but I still use it a lot. And human-computer interaction as a set of courses and a set of practical exercises and a way of thinking about the world really has started to sort of become part of computer science curricula in the States. And that's in part because of various associations like the ACM and the work that we've been doing to make sure that when we build technologies, we think about the people who are going to be using them and the societies that are going to be adopting them. So it's a discipline it's more of a sort of field of endeavor with multiple different disciplines contributing, including things like the technology, the devices, and the interfaces that we see every day. And I think some of you are building some of the infrastructures that lead to the devices that we use all of the time. Interaction and service design. So there are aspects of using computational technology, which is very much more like a service than a quick interaction. You're connecting to your bank or something, for example. And there's a whole service infrastructure there. HCI scholars think about the physical environment. And indeed, a lot of the history of HCI, human-computer interaction, came from ergonomics, the sort of physical devices that people use every day and the layout of things like cockpits. So the physical environment in which you are makes a huge difference to how you can use something. A great example would be, has anybody been out and you're looking at this bright sunshine and you look at your screen and you can't see the screen anymore? The physical context of use makes a huge difference. People and practices. So at the center of human-computer interaction, as you would expect, are people. It's thinking about the people's perspectives and the things that they do every day, their practices. What do they do with technology and why? And finally, a lot of scholars in HCI draw on trying to understand societies and the policies that you have, because any society might have a policy, for example, around the storage of personal data, something that I think is very close to all our hearts and concerns. And the society's policy the governmental restrictions on how data is stored and can be shared will have an impact on the experiences you have of services and of the computational devices and services in your life. So human-computer interaction draws from all of these different areas and contributes to all of these different areas. And I'm going to keep trying to explain that as we go along. And I thought to just situate some of the work I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about some of the other kinds of work and kinds of conference that are sort of human-centric, that an association like the Computing Machinery Association sponsors. So we sponsor many, many conferences, and these are some of the ones that really deal with people and technology. You've all heard the words user experience, I'm sure. This is a sort of field of endeavor that sort of came out of HCI and various other fields, but it really tends to focus much more on technology, devices and interfaces, and the interaction and service design, and not the other aspects that I mentioned. And as Jeff said in my introduction, I'm one of the directors of user experience at Google, and Google is investing more and more in this area, so there's actually quite a few of us now. And we tend to focus very much on the devices, and also on some of the interactions and services that we have, for example, Gmail, Maps, and so forth. Another area of endeavor and investigation is user interface and software technology. This is a conference that the ACM sponsors, and that tends to focus very much on the technology and trying to think about where the future is with those sort of new interactions that are being built, new kinds of, for example, pen-based interaction or gesture-based interaction. Ubiquitous and tangible computing. These are other terms you might have heard of. And these scholars tend to think about the physical environment a lot more. They try to think about how computation devices is ubiquitous. It's starting to become embedded in our physical environment. Think about, for example, smart homes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then there's areas such as computer-supported cooperative work and studies of social media, which tend to look at the technology, but they're really focusing a lot more on this people and practices aspect, because they're looking at the cooperative work. So think about your work environment and how you collaborate with people every day, whether you're distant or together, and how you share resources in real time or asynchronously. There's a large amount of research being done in that area. So there's HCI, and HCI touches on all of these and contributes and draws from all of these different kinds of areas. And you'll find HCI scholars going to these other kinds of conferences as well to specialize in particular areas, but to contribute to the bigger conversation. So if we start to think about this in terms of, society and culture, I just wanted to show a slightly different representation to give you a bit of a framework. So if you think about the infrastructure at the bottom, all of the kinds of things that we do to make the internet work, to have devices, anything that we interact with the internet or any kind of computation has some kind of surface. And I'm working a lot right now on the glass surfaces in our phones. I work on phones and tablets and so forth on a design system called material design, which is in fact a system for screens but draws on physical materiality, and I'll illustrate that. But you can also imagine an interface being, voice interface. More and more voice interfaces are coming into our homes. So that's another kind of interface. And so if you're interfacing to resources through, touch or vision or voice or typing, the interactions that occur are basically the logical sequence of things you do in order to get something done. So as we're going up here, you can think of those as sort of micro interactions. You start to go up to sort of the interconnections, like I was just talking about in collaborative work, between different devices and different people. And you start to go up into organizations. And so the kinds of collaborations, the kind of communications you have fit into sort of organizations. So if you're collaborating, it's in your department, it's with your fellow students. An organization could also be a family organization. If you use social media to connect to people with whom you have some familial relationship. Or it could be, your neighborhood. And then you start to go up to more macro structures, which is like, how do you communicate with the government? More and more government resources are coming online. And as you're going up, you're starting to think about these as sort of economic and social and socio-technical large-scale systems. And so this is one of the ways that scholars have talked about these different sort of, dimensions, if you like. The sharp end is where you're actually touching something on the device here. You're interacting with your favorite social media site, right? That's the sharp end of interaction at that micro scale. But that interaction is affected by all of the things that come down from the top end, from the economic pressures, from the guidelines, and from the restrictions that might be in place around, as I say, the sharing of personal data. So whenever you're designing for the users, who are people, in their fullness, you're always inheriting something from that bigger set of structures. And the question is, how do you make sure you take those things into account? Think of it as sort of design constraints. So where I'm working most of the time is at this level, and that's where I'm going to stay very much today. I'm always thinking about the bigger picture and always working with people who are building infrastructures, but my particular focus is right there around interfaces, interactions, and interconnections between people. But as I say, you're always having to take this into account. A good example of why that or how that can be the case is if you're live in a different part of the world, where there might be different kinds of services available, restrictions, and or cultural norms about how technology gets used. Another thing that we should think about is, as you're studying all of these different levels, as people are participating in these different levels, how do you start to communicate the insights you have? And I'm going to illustrate later how a design system can embody knowledge. Because you've got technical innovation at the bottom, and you're often sharing that engineering or computer science or whatever innovation in the academic context through conferences and peer review, maybe patenting, maybe prototypes, maybe startups. But if you're at the research insights level, which is where a lot of my work is and my team's work, again, I'm publishing in academic contexts, but I'll obviously sometimes be pushing things out on blogs, or I'll be going and giving talks, or I'll be trying to talk to product teams about how to take up the research insights into products and giving talks internally. Now, as you start to go up, the knowledge that you have from these different research areas gets codified in different ways, and this is how you scale knowledge. Right? So we scale knowledge in the academic context through peer review and publication and replication and collaboration. But you can also take principles and you can create guidelines, and I'm going to illustrate that, so that even people in, vastly different areas can read the summary of what it is that you found out, for example, about human perception through things like principles of information grouping in interfaces. So those principles are derived from psychological experimentation, but go into guidelines and best practices so that anybody anywhere can take them up and put them into practice. And of course, at the top of all of that would be something like standards. So, you get standards bodies who are very concerned to provide guidelines for the development or the design of interactions for people. And this is a good example. This is the W3C standard on basically legibility, right? So it's ensuring that a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 exists between text and images of text and background behind the text. That is a guideline that has come through years and years and years of research and discussion and experimentation, but it's out there so that if anybody who hasn't got a background in visual perception wants to create an experience for a user that is perceptible, this is a good guideline for them to follow. So there you have, a best practice codified in a guideline that is really summarizing a lot of research. And the talk I'm going to give today is really about how we're trying to do that through this design system called material that I'll tell you about. So with that as a sort of framing and a background to try and illustrate how, the big picture and the very small effort can scale, I want to talk a little bit about the past of HCI as a discipline. This is the ACM's special interest group, again, the Association for Computing Machinery. This is a special interest group on computer-human interaction. I think it's the second biggest group, special interest group of the ACM. The ACM is about 100,000 professionals. And I think SIG-Chi is currently sitting at around between 4,000 and 5,000. And these folks are interested in human-computer interaction. And this is a picture that was taken from the first conference of human-computer interaction, and that was in 1983. And so if we sort of go back in time to 1983, this is a little bit before 1983. But, a screen, a surface, and people sitting at a desk and, typing. And I wanted to put this over here to emphasize that point that I mentioned earlier, that a lot of HCI really did sort of come from ergonomics, physical ergonomics. A lot of scholars had that as a background. But the work that was being done was to understand how people could perceive on a screen and understand the information on a screen, which was not the beautiful graphical interfaces that we have now. So how do you help people understand? And one of the fields that came out then was this idea of cognition, thinking, cognitive ergonomics. So this is ergonomics of the body. How do you design something so that it fits the way people think, that fits the way human information processing occurs? So that's the sort of thing that was really driving people to that first conference. And that first conference, they didn't expect very many people to show up, and I think they ended up with something like 900 people, and they were expecting like 100. And what that told them was that there was this giant interest out there in making these amazing devices accessible to people, because people understood the power of bringing these devices, computers, into everyday lives, not just working lives, but it's like, how do you make them usable? So this is what was going on in 1983. And yes, it makes me feel a little old, because I remember a bunch of these. There's Microsoft Word, yay! These are from the Computer History Museum. So if you ever have a chance and you want to sort of think back into the past of, computation and devices and consumer electronics, the Computer History Museum is a great one to go and look at. But I remember sort of CD-ROM starting to arrive in the post and so forth. But one of the things, that's a sort of consumer electronics sort of evolution. One of the things that people were really thinking about then a lot in trying to get an understanding of how we can get people to use these devices was the distinction between discretionary use, consumer use, and required use. And so required use might be you have to use these devices for work. So automation systems at work were already starting to, computers were appearing on desks and people were using computers. And the required use, of course, came with a lot of training. So you were trained how to use these devices, and there was sort of like, support internally. So you'd start as a novice and you'd get training. And if it was really critical for your work, you'd get a lot of training. So, in safety-critical systems, which were using computers, there'd just be a huge amount of training that went along before you could pick something up and use it. You certainly couldn't pick it up and just get away with it straight away. So you would develop expertise. Discretionary use, how we started off with our phones and so forth, it was discretionary use, and it's increasingly or decreasingly discretionary, because this is how we connect with each other. And as I say to things like, governments, we kind of go online. And that line around mental models is really important, because as you go from a novice who knows nothing to an expert, you're building a mental model of how the system works. And I'm going to try and illustrate how we have scaffolded, if you like, given people ways to understand a very complex system through metaphors. And you help people sort of on board to think about how to use something through metaphor. So you can train people, but you can also leverage what they already know. And a good example will be something like email. A lot of the early email systems tried to use the metaphor of posting letters and mailing things so that you would send stuff off. And, you know, that can work so far and then break down. So you're always thinking about how brittle using a mental model is. But the early work in HCI was really focusing on this. It's like, how critical is the system, and how do you build expertise, and how do you leverage what people already know so that they can quickly start using something. That is in fact blank. Oh, wait. Why is this blank? All right. Okay. This seems to be working. All right. This is the thing you never want to have happen, right? As I was saying, human-computer interaction. All right, I'm just going to plug this back in here, see if I can get this to work. For some reason. Oh, here's another great human-computer interaction. Passwords. How do we feel about passwords in the audience? We're going to come to that one later. Yes! I win. Yes. Thank you. I win. All right, now. No, I don't win. Isn't this fantastic? All right, I'm trying to understand why this is happening. Isn't this always the way? I'm going to do that performance art thing. Okay. Is there anyone here doing AV? So that's on, but can you plug that in to something else? What I'm going to show you, he's going to laugh at me now. So that idea of the metaphor, I'm going to show you the actual pictures, but I'll whiz through them quickly. So one of the first things that people did was they created the GUI. So the GUI came out in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, was really being sort of tried out. So the graphical user interface, the first model that people used, and you'll see it, was using a metaphor of a desktop. So you'd have piles of paper, and you'd have a little trash can. And the idea was that people who had no idea about how to do computer science or to use a computer would be able to just use their knowledge of what it was like to have a desktop to file things or put things in the trash. So I've got a few old examples of that. And there was a fantastic paper that was written in the early 80s by a couple of scholars who are sort of fairly well known at the beginning of HCI. And it was called Analogy Considered Harmful. And what they started looking at was, when does a mental model, when does something that's a nice model like the desktop actually break? And I'll give you a personal example, which was the first time I used a Mac. And you used to have to drag the image of the floppy disk. How many people in this audience remember floppy disks? Oh, thank goodness. You used to drag the floppy disk into the trash can. And I remember sitting there utterly frozen, because I thought, if I dragged my floppy disk into the trash can, would it wipe the floppy disk? It wouldn't just eject it, right? So there was these ways in which the analogy was breaking down for me. And as you'll see as we're going forward, how those kinds of analogy worked effectively for some situations and not others. And there are some spaces in which you just can't get away from doing the training. What is happening? Oh, you're kidding. Why is it not coming on here? It was on. So, the big thing you can't do with human-computer interaction is if you haven't got any battery. It's not working. Iman, have you got your Mac charger? You don't have a charger? It was working when I plugged it in earlier. Because when I went over to the loo, it was working. Is this the new Mac? But if you've got, have you got one of these? Have you got one of these? He thinks that's blown. Always have a backup. All right. Okay. So you think that's blown? Oh. Does anybody want to know what happened? You'll laugh when you see my last slide. I promise. You know. So you know what I was saying about computer-supported cooperative work? Ta-da! Nothing works without an expert. What's happening? Oh, there we go. The lights are coming on. Yes! Yes! Isn't that gorgeous? All right. Open recent. Da, da, da. Now, where were we? Here we go. All right. Ta-da! Yes! So 1980. So this is what it sort of looked like, you know, to sort of do programming. And this is what I was saying. The Xerox Star in 1981 was the first attempt, the graphical user interface, to start laying things out, to use people's existing mental models so that we could much more quickly get people up and using the technologies. And we'll come to direct manipulation in a minute. But this was General Magic's Magic Cat, which is a communication device. And you can see how it's so directly trying to use the knowledge people already have of these different elements in their lives to get them to take an action. So each of these icons is inviting an action. And when I sort of, said that you could look at your phones, take a look at the icons that you have right now and start to think about which ones, are really obvious to you and you obviously know what to do next. And which ones are less obvious, like, for example, the hamburger menu. Do people know what I mean by the hamburger menu? So there's little lines along the side, usually at the top left or something, where you click on it and you get more information. This was one of the great innovations, the hamburger menu, and I would love to know how many people were totally confused and who are still looking at it and wondering, A, why it's called a hamburger menu, but B, who came up with that. So this is Alan Kay, 1976. This was at Xerox PARC. This was the first desktop model that was really sort of tried out. So, there's your contacts or whatever and your calendar. So it looks like a calendar that you would have on your wall. So, everything old is new again or something. Now, this was the work in the early 1990s, so you had the graphical user interface, but now you started to get direct manipulation. And people like Ben Schneiderman and others were saying, oh, look, all of this, it's like this sort of physical, it looks physical, but what you have to do is drag a mouse over and click on it. Let's start to actually use direct manipulation. And this is some of the beautiful work that he did with Catherine Plaisant, and they were looking at real sort of toggles. You can see up there, they started to do experimental work to look at the toggles and to try out to see, this was to get somebody to manage their air conditioner, which I'd still find to be almost impossible personally. But yeah, so they tried out all of these different looks and feels of these toggles to see which ones worked best. And you can actually start to see, I think that slide to unlock looks a little familiar to a lot of people maybe. And we still have the direct manipulation things down here, which were really inspired by a lot of this early work. And I was saying about that idea about principles and guidelines. Many folks who are implementing these kinds of interactions right now may not know that the roots of the work was back in these HCI and human factors people way back when, because the ideas have been bubbled up into best practices and guidelines. And that, if you're in a peer review committee, might feel like, oh, it's not great because my work didn't get credit. But if what you want to do is scale and get really great human-centered practices out into the world, this is a perfectly fine way to go, right? To get ideas out and disseminated. And, the Android ecosystem, for example, is full of a lot of developers and designers who are building experiences for everyone in the world. And so getting really good guidelines out there is very important to a company like ours. And I just wanted to put that in there because that slight swipe to unlock was very much, I think, part of the experience that people thought was brand new when they got their iPhones. So how did all of this knowledge, all of those experiments like Catherine's and other people's experiments, how were we disseminating that knowledge originally? Well, we were building models like this. This is the Model Human Processor. This was the first book which had the title Human-Computer Interaction, the Psychology of Human-Computer Interaction, that drew explicitly on experimental work with people to try and understand the cognition of how people do reasoning, and to try and make predictions about what would be hard for you to do and what would be easy. What kind of icon or what kind of programming task would people find difficult because of the way human memory and human information processing works? And what could we do with a model like this to make predictions about time taken to succeed, about errors, and about confusion? So this was a sort of model which you would sort of run as a designer to make predictions. And there was a great study that was done which was looking at telephone operators for 9X, I think it was. And they basically built models based on this kind of analysis of human information processing and made predictions about what was going to be easy or hard. And then they demonstrated through empirical evidence that the model played out. And they ended up saving a huge amount of time for the operators on the basis of this. The other way we codify knowledge is through books. And that's a great way, if you're in class and your professor says you must read these books. But it's not necessarily a great way to get all of the ideas out to a general audience. So, as I was saying, summarizing all of this research, guidelines and principles can be a really great way to take all of that rich knowledge, codify it, and share it. And this is a great example that still exists today. This is the Apple guidelines. And you can see that a lot of that work, which a lot of people did to demonstrate, how to make something usable, ends up being codified in these really, really simple rules and guidelines for designers. And then you can take each one of these and unpack those. This is one of my favorites. This comes from 1996. This was Apple's Newton, which did not succeed as a product, but I still think the guidelines are absolutely fantastic for a couple of reasons. One is because the guidelines incorporate human information processing insights, particular recommendations for design, and code. And so this was, one of the first ones that I came across where you could actually see all of that in one place. It wasn't just make it beautiful. It was, and here's how you can do it, and here's why you want to do it, and here's what beautiful means in this context. So design systems. So all of that was to give you some background in thinking about how design affects interaction and experience, and how we can codify that knowledge into design systems. And so I want to start talking now about material design. And material design is Google's design system. And Google's design system, material.io, you can find more information. And so there are many, many, many products that Google has, but also, as I say, the Android ecosystem, plus iOS. A lot of experiences and apps out there where what we want is for people to have a sort of beautiful, lovely experience. And the story goes that Larry Page, several years ago, asked us to address making Google's products more consistent and more beautiful. And Google was not known for design. That has since changed, and in large part because of material. So in about 2014, a bunch of folks started to think about what should we do for a design system. This is the website you can go to, material.io, and you'll see guidelines and resources, and also tools to help you sort of understand how to apply some of these specifications. So the material design team was sort of organic, and it built up. And material design, everybody gets confused because it isn't actually material. It is inspired by material as a metaphor. It's a philosophy, a metaphor, some specific guidelines, some specifications, components, and it drives an experience, but also brand, how you can express brand. And there's a community around material. So the specific metaphor here really is on tactile reality, and I'll show you some examples. And the idea is it's the visual interface, it's the typography, the visual, it's the interaction design, and it's the motion design, animation in the interface. And when you take an action, what happens? And the idea here is that, you know, the innovations in our personal technologies, we can take advantage of those, but you really want to bring that digital interaction and computation to everybody. So how do you get everybody? You know, I was talking about the novice to expert in the mental model. How do you get people onboarded, feeling expert really quickly? And how do you allow people to not just do discretionary and recreational things, but productivity activities as well? And these are very different kinds of app experience. If you look at your phone, you're going to have a load of different apps that have different purposes and different levels at which you want to sort of learn, spend the time to really understand. So the idea that was material design would be a single underlying system that allows for a unified experience across different devices and platforms. Because, of course, we move across from tablets to phones to desktops now. So you can go and have a look in the spec. But, you know, this idea is that you've got this material metaphor, you've got bold, very, very beautiful, you've got a bunch of fantastic designers who really have thought from almost like, you know, the haute couture of design and color schemes to render something that's aesthetically beautiful, but also where information can be presented in ways that are salient. And this motion idea is baked in. So here are the sorts of experiments that the designers were doing and continue to do before implementation occurs. So materiality is represented through, for example, layering and using shadow to suggest what is at the top and what is at the back. What I'm hoping is that if you haven't got a design background, as you go away after today, you'll start to look at the apps on your phone differently and start to think about how the designers and the developers are trying to suggest to you how to take an action and what an action will do. So here they're using shadow. The idea of bending. So material design was really, there was a lot of inspiration from paper. And so how do you imply that in a rendition, like something like this? And inspired by designers of the physical from the Bauhaus, there were a lot of workshops that took place where people actually started to work with physical artifacts and physical paper to say, are we just making it up, or how do we really render this design beautifully in the interface? So here are some of the design studies, and you might start to recognize icons and so forth here. So what does it look like if you have light from different angles? What shadows are created? And of course, you're starting to see how that ended up being this. Do people recognize this icon? So, it was really inspired by this idea of creating a sort of depth in the interface to make it visually appealing. So again, more experimentation with shadow and perspective and a little bit of color there for salience. You sort of draw the eye. Here's some sort of device layouts and what does it look like in context. So really trying these things out. And this was trying to think about materiality and hovering and space in other ways. So these are all the kinds of experiments that are being done, again, to do that kind of scaffolding, using visual perception to get people to see things in a different way. And this idea of natural is really interesting. So here you've got the layering. This is illustrating the layering. And it should be natural that this thing that's right in front of you is actually the dominant foveal visual activity, and what's behind is secondary. So the color, the surface, iconography are all used to emphasize different kinds of action. And a lot of experimentation has gone on to thinking about dimensionality, affording interaction. And that concept of affording is suggesting an interaction to you and inviting you to it so that you have a sense of what's important in this particular interface that you see. So this is the elevation model, that what's on top and what's behind and how is a shadow cast. And if you start to look at the apps that you're using, start to think about how the designers might have really tried to render this. So there you can start to see the layering, and you can start to see, again, I hope, what an app might look like. So we're looking right now at the design work, but behind this is a lot of principles from design that have come from a lot of experimentation. This, I hope you'll recognize, start to see maps, how information is layered on a map, what is at the top, and what you can touch and interact with, and what the response and action is going to be. So, the visual thing at the bottom is providing the palette, if you like. And then you start to see these different layers of what's important based on what we understand that people want to do with this information. And the idea here is that you use these kinds of buttons, so the icons are designed very specifically to initiate change, to get users to invite. It's like you press that microphone and you have an idea that that is going to be something that you can take an action on, and what is it going to do. So the animation also. So it's getting more and more complicated, right? Because there's layers of information. Which is the action moment? There's motion occurring, and how do you choreograph motion to happen so that it's not discordant and things all going in different directions so that you confuse the user visually? Now, this might all look sort of easy or beautiful or whatever, I hope, but these are actually really, really difficult to bring about and to try out with people. It's a different scale, but a lot of people talk about VR making them nauseous. So there's a huge amount of work goes into how the visual perception will not affect the physiological reaction. Here, we're trying to do the visual perception will not confuse the cognitive processing. It'll be clear to you what to do, and it'll be designed so that you understand what's going on, and that your actions have feedback of the right kind. So again, you've got this motion and it provides meaning, but the motion might be different for a music app than a calendar. What kind of motion are people expecting? As something moves, will it occlude information that's actually very valuable to the task? How do you want to make more information salient? So it's also really hard when you think about adaptive design. So I said, you've got your tablet, you've got your phone, you've got other things. So how do you adapt across all of these different devices? I'm a designer or I'm an engineer. I've got this specification that you've got this beautiful motion that's going to be sort of choreographed and not occlude information. It's not going to move so fast that the users are like, oh, goodness me. It's not going to go so slow that they think that their device is somehow broken. And that might be different across different amounts of surface area. So something that's on your screen that's this big on your phone, how it traverses on a tablet is likely to have a different trajectory, perhaps a different speed. And that has perceptual consequences, design consequences, but engineering consequences. So how do you engineer to make sure that the experience feels the same, even though the visual layout is different, the amount of eye gaze that you can look, the target area is different. So there's a huge amount of work has gone into also looking at different devices, because there's different devices of different sizes. But when you are working with people in the Android ecosystem of many, many, many manufacturers and many different kinds of just phone, for example, starting to look at all of these different phones and all of the different dimensions and also the density and how if you like, how refined the particular phone is, you've got a different set of experiences. So how do you actually create something that feels like it's the same? Well, you have to have the engineering specifications to know and to try and test things out. So this is one of the tools. I said the design system has guidelines, it has specifications, it has suggestions for visual. But it also has suggestions for engineering implementation across different kinds of platform. So that's why it becomes a system as opposed to just a set of guidelines, because you're really trying to give people the tools they need to engineer something. And these are some of the different things. So I have not been working in this particular area for that long, only a few years, and I had no idea until I started working into it just how many different kinds of elements there are that go into making a very simple, what feels like a very simple interaction. You've got action buttons, scrolling techniques, you've got dialogues, typography. I'm going to show you some examples. Data tables, how do you lay data tables out? So if you look at spec, there are all of these different kinds of elements that you want people to be able to draw from. And because it's a giant ecosystem, people are building new elements all of the time and also contributing into that broader community. But, buttons, tabs, notifications. How does a notification pop up? What's the animation for it? Does it interrupt? What's its visual look? I'm hoping, like I say, you'll look at your phones later and you'll be like, I had no idea there was so much. If you're not in this area, if you're already in this area, you know. So, here are just some of the things, trying out the different interaction elements. I mentioned permissions and notifications, trying different things out. Do you have here are some different ideas for sort of, swiping. Here's some different layouts. This is back from 2014. The idea of redlining and how you have things that are the right proportions for the screen size and how you do layout. This is drawing on a huge amount of perception, but also typography and layout. So you've got visual design elements coming in and, helping a lot of very smart engineers to understand this is why this matters, here's how to implement it, this is the latitude you can have. And this is more the work of my team, very specifically. So my team is the research team that starts to look at some of these elements. So you'll have, for example, here we have text fields. And I talked about affordances earlier. There are sort of 7 or 8 different kinds of text field that were being tested out. And so what we did was we did a series of studies where we used Mechanical Turk and had hundreds of people literally try out the text fields. And all of the text fields fit within the general guidelines for material, but some of them were more explicitly, you can see, some of them used a lot of shadow, some of them didn't. Some of them were just lines. This is just a couple of the conditions. And then we looked to see where people clicked, and we got their subjective responses, and we had them do tasks, and then we generated a lot of data to say, here are the ones that perform really well in task, and here are the ones which may look aesthetically pleasing and be part of the system, but it seems that they perform less well for people more generally. So here we've got design, which is based on potentially years of looking at people reacting to different kinds of elements. And now we've got experiments which start to validate and or give some kind of more nuance to those designs. And so, as I say, we've been looking at these and making recommendations. And as part of the design system, we're going to start publishing our results and our methodology for studying these, so that, again, folks who are out there in the broader Android ecosystem who may not have user experience research on team can actually learn a little bit about some of the best practices for evaluating how their interfaces are working for people. So we're going to start publishing some of that soon. Here's another one. I mentioned legibility, and I showed you the standards earlier. This is, just one of the studies, trying to understand how text, whether it's legible or not, over very rich images and over different kinds of saturation. And we've literally got the contrast ratios up there. We looked at what the guidelines said. And then we started to do different kinds of treatment over the image to see whether the image was obscured. If it was that important? Was it not? But could people read what the text said? And we've just started getting some really interesting results through that. So again, one of the things we're starting to do more and more of is include accessibility and sort of diversity in terms of, for example, in this instance, sort of visual perception, to really put that into the guidelines as well. And this has consequences for the devices I mentioned earlier, because if you have a sort of low-resolution device, you might have a very different experience from if you have a very high-end device. So we're going to start really trying to test about what are the sort of parameters, if you like, around which you can play around with some of this stuff. Icons I mentioned earlier. There is a huge resource for icons, and we've started to do some tests around which are the right icons, which ones are perceptible, back to the mental models, which ones are easy to understand and which ones are confusing. And here's something I'd love to ask of this audience. If anybody knows any research or has any insights into cultural differences in terms of icons and what works and what doesn't, please let me know, because I'm really interested in starting to find out which icons actually work across different cultures and which don't. Again, not if you're an expert and you know what a hamburger menu is, but if you're more of a novice, what strikes you as just utterly confusing, because we don't know. And I mentioned fonts. I just happen to be a little obsessed with fonts. I love fonts. Google Fonts has many, 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 many fonts, and we have a huge amount of use of these fonts. And there's some really lovely studies that are being done at the moment, which are like, how does a font suggest a personality for your site? If you're a bank, what kind of font will you use? If you're more playful, what kind of font? And there's a lot of evidence that shows that people's subjective and emotional reactions to fonts are much stronger than you would think. Has anybody ever had an email from somebody in sort of like, bold 32, all caps, red? I mean, that's not just a font, but it's also just a bit jarring. Or Comic Sans. Do we know what Comic Sans is? Comic Sans was so big in the 1990s, and now I see Comic Sans, and I'm like, no more Comic Sans. Although I actually kind of still like it a little bit. But these also have perception issues. So one of the sets of studies we've been doing is looking at what fonts are better for reading at distance on large displays. And, it's fascinating what's working for different things. This is something else that some of the folks on the material design team did, which I thought was really lovely, frankly. They did some analyses, and they said that in the emoji sets, there were very few women represented in any kind of professional capacity. And so there were a bunch of studies done, and a bunch of these were produced, and then we tested them out and tried them out. And here are some of the emoji for professional women, because there just weren't enough. So the other thing I said was that material design is not just a system and a set of guidelines and a set of inspirations. Material design isn't just an invitation to kind of think about consistency and the sort of human user experience. It's also a community. And so SPAN is a conference that Google runs for designers. and for engineers to really think about the broader community of design. And these kinds of activities have been very much part of putting Google on the map for design. And there are design awards which were kicked off at Google I/O in 2015. And this is really recognizing the great work that designers are using and the great kinds of contributions producing and the great kind of contributions that they're having to the design conversation more broadly. So here are some examples. So this was the Google web interface in 2011, and this was the sort of next iteration as materials started to come in. And you'll see that it's actually changed even since then. And this idea of space, and this idea of color, and this idea of these different buttons. And here you're starting to see the evolution a little bit of some of the shadow with the compose button. Here are just some of the external folks who have been using material design guidelines to some extent, and material design spec. And these were from the first sort of real big refresh a couple of years ago. But I think you'll see these are the kinds of things that people said they wanted and that they were getting from using material design. So they'd have their app, they'd use material design, and then they'd take a bunch of metrics and measures. And here are just some examples. They've found more engagement with that floating action button, which was one of the sort of innovations material brought in. You know, more revenue. So people are, you know, I said about taking action. If you make an action salient, more people taking action. So there's the aesthetic experience of liking using the thing, the app, but then taking an action becomes easier because of the salience in the interface. Delight, people saying, reporting that it just felt better, the color schemes were better. And I haven't done this research, but I'm really intrigued about this idea that these kinds of aesthetic experiences just make people feel calmer or happier or whatever. The fab, again, that floating action button is the fab. Animations, so, you know, people using animations and trying to think about how animations will bring the eye to the action or give the feedback that the action has been successful. Understanding features. This one was boosting user engagement with more features. So anyway, so those are some of the examples. So material design has really started to create conversations and give people some practical solutions. And a lot of the folks, especially out in the bigger world, really are, you know, they might be small and scrappy, they might be startups, they might not have a lot of resources for designers and user experience researchers. So that's that amplification and that sort of impact factor that I was talking about. So we're thinking about how shadow and elevation works in more complex sites like this. We're thinking about super apps from China, and, you know, does material design fit there, or does it not? Open question. Material design already has this idea of elevation. How do you take material design or something like it into augmented reality? What does it mean to have a design system and a design spec around augmented reality? Here are some of the other devices. Someone was asking about Google Glass earlier. What kind of design system for interaction do you have when the surface is a brain or skin or under the skin? What kinds of guidelines do we need for the future for people? We've already seen something like material is working very nice on these flat screens. What do we need to do in this space as these get taken up more? I've been talking about accessibility and usability, and we're increasingly making sure that we bake diversity into every test so that we can really understand what a range of different users with different kinds of potentially impairments, how can we design for them? Devices that have no screens. What does it mean to have a design system for conversation? And actually, there's a whole bunch of effort at Google right now, which is, you know, sort of conversations on Google, which is how you design a really great conversation. So these are the interconnections of ubiquitous and tangible and wearable and embedded, embodied practices for which we don't have good design systems yet. We don't know how to design for these interconnected devices very well yet. and the complicated smart home. How do these all fit together? If you've got 5 different ecosystems with 5 different kinds of standard for their interface and interaction design, I don't know about you, but if I go from one ecosystem to the next, I'm often pressing the wrong button or saying the wrong thing. So those are just some interesting challenges for design systems and for best practices as these devices come into the world. And we need to understand more about how they're being used by people in the world. So if that's still at the interaction level, more of that pointy end, the sharp end, there's also a lot of work to be done in human-computer interaction at that blunt end. And I just wanted to show you this because how many people know about Maslow's hierarchy? A few of you, yeah, great. Well, this is a classic old thing from psychology, right? And it really talks about, you know, at the top you've got growth, and at the bottom you've got survival and your needs, right? So when I was thinking about what we've done with interaction and human-computer interaction, but with technology in general, I'd say we're doing pretty well on the aesthetic and the cognitive, especially with something like material and these design systems and all of these years of understanding how to present information to people. I've put a question mark around esteem and belonging and love because people tell me that social media makes them feel loved. Other people tell me it doesn't, and I think the jury is out. So I put a question mark, but it's an orange question mark. And the red question mark at the bottom is, I think we're really at the beginning of thinking about safety and physiology and these tools. Safety, for example, I mentioned data safety earlier. You know, I think we're at the beginning, and that is part of human-computer interaction. We've got these gorgeous devices. You know, we've got these self-driving cars and all the rest of it. This was a few years ago where a bunch of people hacked into a car while somebody was driving and basically took over control of it while he was driving. Doesn't feel so safe. We're hearing more and more about hacked homes and ransomware. You know, these don't feel safe. There's a bunch of stuff that's happened more recently. And this is my favorite quote from William Gibson. The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So up at that blunt end, there's my Maslow's hierarchy again. Some people don't have this. And I just want everybody to laugh with me at the next slide. When your power thing blows, you get to sit while I fumble for a while. right down there. Finally, artificial intelligence, we've had a lot of conversation around that, and algorithmic bias. We really need to challenge this because all of those interactions and interfaces and all of that gorgeous stuff that's happening, information recommendation, we don't really know where this is going, and we have to really investigate it because folks who are really at the sort of infrastructure layer are affecting the pointy end and the blunt end, and there's giant amounts of bias. So here's the big picture, and as I say, HCI, human-computer interaction, deals with all of this, if not directly, then in partnership. And we really, really, really need to think about all of these different aspects. And no one group or one person can do it all, but understanding that they affect each other, I think, is really important for making decisions about what one does in one's research or in one's practice. Before I stop, I also wanted to say that going forward into the future, the ACM is sort of there are many professional bodies. The ACM is the one that I happen to be very involved with. And we have a thing called a Future Generations of Computing, the Future of Computing Academy. This started last year. The first cohort was 48 people who are early in career, applied and got grants to become this first academy and to work with each other. And this was across computer science, not just HCI, although I think there were 5 people from HCI. And the idea here is to provide a platform and a forum for folks who are thinking about everything from the sharp end to the blunt end, from infrastructure and heavy technical to interaction and social, to think about where we are going in the future. And so if anyone wants to know more about that, please let me know, because we'll be getting our second cohort fairly soon. Also, I wanted to put a shout out for the Women in Computing efforts at the ACM, Because another part of bias is often that, it's not just women, but diversity in general in computer science. We're trying to really address that. Finally, I wanted to give a shout out. There is Arab HCI, an organization started in 2016. We're trying to think about the specifics for this region in the human-computer interaction arena, in terms of sort of cultural needs and different perspectives and bringing a different voice to the table, but also about who is participating and who is not, and how can we get a diversity of voices, because, of course, we all, unconsciously bring bias on our own cultural bias when we are building and designing systems, and so the more diversity you can have in your sort of collegial group, the more we can address those biases and design for everybody and have equitable computing and equitable human-computer interaction. And I think that is also the future of HCI and the future of technology design. And so with that, I want to thank a number of people, the team who brought me here in particular, and Jeff, thank you for your lovely introduction. And also to the material design team more broadly, which is about 150 people, about 50 engineers, 50 designers, and a bunch of other sort of collaborators. And my team in particular, the material experience research team, who are really bringing research and grounding a lot of the design and I wouldn't say validating so much as extending and expanding our knowledge of how to apply the design principles. So with that, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Elisabeth. And we do have an opportunity for questions. There's a mic going around, and okay.
What would be the main argument of creating this Arab HCI? The question is like, do you have any Asian HCI, for example?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Now, I want to be clear, I did not set it up and we did not set it up, but one of the great things about the human-computer interaction community generally, whether ACM or not, is that there are a lot of local chapters who self-organize to come together. And so there was a bunch of folks who basically felt that there were scholars in the sort of Arab world who would potentially have their own ideas and their own issues about cultural specificity, but also would want a community so that there are people who are close who they can talk to about, particular designs or just build community. So I was involved in helping set up a KAI chapter out in Indonesia. And so there's a lot of local area chapters, but a lot of the ideas will bubble up to the bigger community. There's a couple of chapters in India. So ACM SIGCHI has a bunch of different chapters that I can put you in touch with. But this particular community, I don't know them personally. I just know that this is a groundswell of activity of people who want to locally discuss, what's special and what's not, and just build a community. A good friend of ours has brought us a workshop to the Computer-Human Interaction General Conference that happens under the ACM once a year. It's called KAI, C-H-I, and that's about 4,000 people. And we have workshops before the main conference starts. And there is one which is specifically focused on issues for HCI in the Arab world this year, organized by a friend, and actually ex-PhD student. I was her advisor.
My question is the following. What is the reason that people switch from this? There was a thing called skeuomorphism like 10 years ago when objects on the screen, they were try to make them as realistic as they are in the physical world, but now design goes to more simple minimalistic kind of style, like material design, and Apple goes the same direction. What is the reason for this? Why designers move in this direction?
I wouldn't like to speculate on why a lot of designers do what they do, because I'm not a designer. But I think there were a couple of reasons that I would speculate around. Firstly, there's a sort of fashion reason, right? So, design moves in fashion, right? So I was thinking about the haute couture and Main Street. But I know that the idea of a lot of white space is that it's sort of aesthetically pleasing, calming, and that you can actually make certain things more salient than other things. So that if there's a lot of clutter, it's hard for a user to know which action to take, what they should do next. And so making everything much simpler is an aesthetic, a desired aesthetic, if you like. Now, where that doesn't work so much, typically, it seems, and this is a hypothesis that we're testing, is that in that expert zone around, for example, work tools, where you've got someone who's an expert, information density, what you perceive to be dense information, is very different when you're an expert, for example, looking at a spreadsheet which you understand, than when you're a novice trying to see what's salient in a very complicated spreadsheet. So the specific example you give, which is of white space, it could be that that aesthetic is really, really pleasing to people and invites actions that are really clear and clean and crisp in certain situations, but that in other situations that might not be the right design. So I think it's sort of it's open, but I think that there is partly fashion, and there's partly this idea of creating beautiful, salient, and simple, elegant interfaces so that the human visual and cognitive processes are not overloaded. That would be my hypothesis, but we should ask a really good designer, which I am not. I feel like, you know, when you're on a plane and say, is there a doctor in the room? Is there a designer in the room? We need one.
Thank you for your presentation. There's been a lot of work on user experience. You've shown a lot of good examples about what's being done at Google. But also software is changing a lot, right? So we're moving to this space where a lot of the software is actually built automatically through machine learning. So in a certain way, the user and the machine are interacting in a way which is maybe different from what it was 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
So does it also make sense to start thinking about machine experience?
Yeah.
Meaning that maybe you want to design in such a way that helps the machine learn faster, or the machine in case of failure, because machines are starting to fail a lot more. Does this make sense?
It absolutely makes sense, and yeah, there are people working on that, and it's really a very important area. I'm co-organizing a symposium under AAAI, which is going to be at Stanford in a couple of months, and it's the user experience of machine learning is what we're calling it, but one of the aspects of is the machine experience of the human, and trying to kind of unpack that so that it's dialogic in an interesting way. And, you know, it's very early days on some of that stuff, but I think it's really important. The other area I think is really exciting is the idea of applying certain kinds of machine learning techniques to exploring design spaces. So, for example, if we had a series of, for example, if we took the design space of clutter to no clutter, and then we just sort of set up a whole bunch of permutations along a set of parameters or scales, and then we had, you know, some kind of interaction over them, could we make predictions about, knowing what we do about human visual salience, could we make predictions about what would work for people and what wouldn't work for people? So that's sort of using sort of different kinds of techniques more as an exploration. We've also done some work where we got screenshots of apps that use, you know, material design or not, and then we just did a huge analysis over them to see which ones seemed to be the most popular and which ones weren't, and what people were looking at, or what we could predict people were looking at or not. So I think there's lots of spaces to really kind of start to apply machine learning techniques and/or analysis techniques from both directions to really push the experience. Yeah.
Anything from this side of
Hello, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering how the company receives feedback from end users about like their experience. So
well, each product has a huge amount of research, and so there are like several different levels of getting feedback from people. One is sort of usage. So there's, you know, log analysis and there's use analysis of any product, all the way through to usability studies in lab and to more ethnographic studies where people go out and researchers go out and study how people are using different, applications or products. And Google has this great thing called the Google Van, which literally has a bunch of researchers in, and they travel around to all kinds of parts of the country and set up usability and interview labs in the van to find out from people what their experience is of Google as a brand or a set of products or whatever. What we also do with material design is I say that material is a community as well as a set of design guidelines, so forth. And so there's always this constant feedback from the material design community of engineers and designers who are trying to design, and they're sharing stuff in various forums and tweeting at us and so forth. So there are so many different kinds of signals, different ways of engaging with the different users. But it's number one priority for every single product and every service at the company.
Thank you very much.
We're going to end the evening there. Thanks again, Elisabeth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you for bearing with me. Thank you.
And we have a thank you for you.
Oh, thanks. Oh, absolutely. Let me put